Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of James Dean Designs. Today we're going to be running through how to install Lightburn, setting it up for your laser and going through some of its basic features. So let's get started. So I just want to start this tutorial by quickly explaining why we're using Lightburn today. Now, if you've seen any of my previous videos, I always try and use free software because I want to make it as accessible as possible for everybody watching. Unfortunately, all my research that I was doing on my laser videos, I couldn't find a single piece of free software that ticked every box. Certain software will do one task, another will do something slightly different, and it all gets a bit complex in trying to figure out what software you need to achieve a certain result. Now, I've been using Lightburn for about 6 months, and it is honestly the best piece of all-round software that you can have for running GRBL lasers. It incorporates photo processing. You can design in it with text and shapes and vectors. You can import things into it. And there is a whole range of settings for controlling your laser and running it at the same time. Now, the reason I'm persevering with it, even though it's paid for software, is there is a free trial period, so you can download it and experience it for yourself before needing to purchase it. So with that out of the way, let's move over to the PC, get it set up, and I'll start to run through some of the basic features. So the first thing we want to do is head to Lightburn's website, which is lightburnsoftware.com. Link will be in the description as always. From there, go download trial. Come down to the bottom of the page and see your various platform options. Mine is a Windows 64-bit machine, so that's what I'll download. For ease, I already have that downloaded, so we'll open it up. And you run through the various setup steps as usual. I just click in next. And once it's installed, you should get a prompt saying, do you want to launch Lightburn? And we do. Give that a second to open. Now, obviously, you get the general usage notices pop up and some tips on hotkeys to use when navigating through the software and doing your designing. It's quite useful to have a glance of these and make a note of them, but they can be recalled later if you need to. Now, when the software opens, the first thing it will do is ask you to find your laser or to install your laser. Now, the reason it wants to do this is because once it knows what laser you have, it can start to control some of the preferences for it. You have two choices. You can click Find My Laser or Create Manually. Now, Find My Laser is the automatic option, so that's where we will start. We'll go through the various steps and it will try and scan the USB ports to find your laser or what laser is connected to your machine. And straight away we can see it's picked up a GRBL machine on COM port 11 and it's got rough dimension sizes for it. So if we click Add Device, now from here we can control the origin of the laser. Now, what Lightburn likes to do is it believes most lasers has limit switches, so it can define the origin of your bed. For default, just leave it as front left. If you have limit switches, great. If you don't, I will show you how to work around this later. Also, you have the auto home your laser at startup, and what this will do is if you do have limit switches, it will just run the homing sequence to find your start point. We don't have limit switches on my machine, so I will leave that turned off for now. And there we are, our machine is now set up within Lightburn. Click Finish and click OK. Now, as I've clicked OK, you may have just seen some of this change down here. This has now selected our machine and knows it's a GRBL machine. But to allow Lightburn to actually connect to the machine, we just need to select the relevant port. I know mine is COM port 11, and obviously you should know what yours is if you previously set your machine up. So we'll select that. And to check this, we can come up to the console tab here, and as you can see, this is now all connected. If we just want to be safe, we can always type our $$ command. And there we are, it pulls through all of our settings. Now I'll just switch back to the layers tab for now. I should also mention that when we first opened Lightburn, My computer skipped the stage where it asks you if you want to do the trial version or use a license code. Obviously it knows I've already had this installed on my machine with a license code, so it did skip that step. But if you get prompted with the trial screen, then obviously select trial, or if you are purchasing it, then input your license code there. The first thing we want to do is define a couple of parameters and settings before we start messing about with anything else in the software. To do this, we go up to Edit and come down to Device Settings. Now the first thing we want to do is set the actual working area of our bed. 320 by 195 is what it's currently showing. I'm just going to play this safe and I'm going to put that to 300 by 180, which should be the rough dimensions of most people's bed on a 3018 machine. You also want to enable the Z-axis control, and if we come a bit further down, you'll see there's this S value max. Now if you've seen my previous videos, you will remember that the S value needs to match your $30 setting. So take a note of your $30 if you haven't already and put that value in here. I happen to know mine is already set at 1000, so we'll leave that as it is. The other setting we want to turn on is Enable Laser Fire button, and all this simply does is turn your laser on at a very low power so you can move it around the bed and find the starting point that you need to. So with all those settings turned on, we can now click OK. So with our device settings changed, we just want to update a few more settings and check they're correct. So if we go up to Edit and then come down to Settings, and we're presented with a new list of options here, and this is where you can start to customize a few things within the software itself. You can turn beginner mode off, which gets rid of a few icons and simplifies it down a bit, but I still think it's better to leave this on and work with everything we have to hand. We've got a few other things where we can change the icon size and the font size if you're struggling to read things. You can also change the grid, the spacings, and how far objects move when you're using the arrow keys. Now the important settings I want to focus on are these, the unit grid settings. Now the reason these are important is because what often happens is when you have a CO2 laser, they move much faster than a diode laser. So sometimes people don't quite realise that the settings can be different between the two of them. And often when you're working with a spindle and using CNC software, those will be in millimeters per minute. So I just wanted to check that this is on the correct setting, which it is. Obviously you may select inches per minute if that is what you're familiar with. Now if your machine can reach the speeds of a CO2 laser, or in fact you are following this tutorial with a CO2 laser, then feel free to select these as well, but these are just my preferred settings that I'm going to stick with. So we'll click OK. So let's take a look at the software itself. Now on the surface it seems quite complex. There are a lot of icons and things that you can select, but we have to remember that at a beginner stage we don't need all of them. We just need some of a few basic tools to get us through and to start us off in this software. Now we'll focus on the stage to begin with. We've already set the parameters of this to the size that our laser can work within, and this is basically your drawing board or your work area. If we come down to the bottom left hand corner, you'll see that there are a green square and a red square. Now the red square is the homing position, and this is where it typically wants to start the job from. If you have limit switches, obviously we set the bottom left hand corner earlier as the homing position, so that's where it will take the start point from. The green square is the origin point. Typically again, if you have limit switches, these will be in the same position, which is the bottom left hand corner. However, if you don't have limit switches, we can set this origin point or the start point to elsewhere, which we will go through shortly because it is relevant for those people that don't have limit switches. Now if we move over to the left hand side, we can start to look at some of the basic tools we can work with. The first few are for drawing. So you have the pencil tool to be able to freeform draw, and you just click at points where you want each anchor to go. And what you can also do with this tool is come down to the edit node tool, which is this one that has the points on the corners. And once you select that and click on the object, you can then move the individual points that you have just drawn by clicking and holding on them. We'll just delete that for now. Your other basic drawing functions are the square, the circle, and then you come down to this one here, which is to add tabs. Now this is probably more advanced. This is if you're cutting things out with the laser, you can add tabs so it holds it in place until you're ready to cut those tabs and move it out of position. The next tool is the text tool, and this is what you will use to create any type of typography that you want, such as when you're creating a sign. You just click on the stage where you want it to be, and then you can free type anything. Once you type in what you want, you can also adjust the fonts and size up here. This menu will only come active when you have the font selected. For example, if we click off the font now, you'll see that menu gets greyed out. When you click back into it, it comes back to life, and you can change the basic settings like the height, the spacing and the alignment. Let's delete that. The next tool on the list is the laser position tool. Again, this is relevant if you have limit switches. What you can do once it's homed the machine in and it knows that this is the bottom left hand corner, wherever you click with this tool on the stage, it will move the laser head to that position. And it's just useful if you're trying to get the laser head in a very specific position to do a certain design. The next few tools that we have are currently greyed out, and that's because we have nothing on our artboard at the moment. But what the first one is for an offset tool. I'll quickly show you this. So if we draw a shape, and you'll now see that that comes active. And what this is useful for is if you want to offset a line outside or even inside this shape that you've done. Again, useful for when you're doing cutting, because you can draw your shape and then offset the cutting area to go around that. So if we click that now, and it will give us a few options of how far offset we want the line, whether we want the corners to be rounded or square, and then whether it's inside, outside. So you can just play about with these and get the setting that you want. I'll cancel that for now and just delete that again. Next we have a few options for merging and separating shapes. Now this is where you have multiple items on screen and you can blend them together or punch one through the other, and I'll just show you that now. So there we have two separate shapes. If we select them both together just by holding the button down and dragging over them, we'll see all these become live. Now each one does something slightly different. For the purpose of this video, I'll just show you the first one, which is welding all the shapes together. Now as you can see, it's merged it all and made it into one line. And again, you can go through it and play with the different settings of these and where you can punch shapes in and out of each other. It's useful if you're trying to do maybe something like an eclipse moon, for example. So if we draw a circle, and then we'll try and draw another circle inside it, and what we should be able to do is select both of these and punch the one through the other, and there you go, it gives you that eclipse moon shape. The next set of tools we have are the array tools. These are really useful for duplicating the same shape in multiple times. So if you're trying to do some sort of grid layout, rather than having to draw or copy and paste the same shape multiple times, you can just draw it once. Select the array tool and it gives you a variety of options of whether you want it horizontal, vertical or both, the space in between them, and then a few different options down here as to whether it's mirrored in one direction or the other. I'll quickly just show you this. As we increase it, it's a live preview of what it's doing, and then as I say, you can adjust the spacings between them as well. So it's a really useful tool for repeating shapes in a set layout. I'll cancel that for now. The next tool is the circular array. This does a similar job, but rather than spacing things out in a grid, it can do it in a circle form. So I'll show you this as a live example. You can see straight away it's stacked it on top of each other. Now the copies is set to 8, that's how many times it's duplicating that same shape. But as you'll see, as we start to increase these spacings, you can see that there is actually 8 shapes in there. Now if we really take this number up, as you can see, it starts to do it in a circular shape, and then we can just keep playing about with these depending on where we want the position of them, and it spaces it out more each time. And it's really one of those tools that you have to go in and understand each setting and get it to the right parameters that you want for the layout you're trying to achieve. It's good for something like a clock face where you want maybe 12 lines going round in a circle, and you can just draw the one at the top and then get it to repeat the others in the pattern that you need. Finally, the last two on this side, we have the direction of cutting or engraving tool. Now, this is probably an advanced feature, but what you can tell it to do is if you draw a shape and you want it to be cut in a particular direction, for example, if you specifically want it to go clockwise or even anti-clockwise, you can state that with this tool. The next one is the radius tool, and this just allows you to add rounded corners to certain shapes that you may be drawn. So you can see that now becomes live, and once I turn the radius on, you can set your desired radius, come up and click on the corner you want it applied to, and it does it. So the joy of this tool is you don't have to apply the radius to every corner, you can just apply it to specific ones that you want it to. Now we come down to these coloured squares at the bottom. Now these are your layers, and this is basically the workflow for within Lightburn. So the great feature here is you can stack different things on top of each other, and you can also give them different settings. And we'll come on to this shortly, but I just want you to note that this is what they are, is the layers section. You've got lots to be able to set in order to have different options while you're designing. Now we come over to the right hand side, and this is where we really start to change all the different options of the speed, the cutting, the power, and also control the laser itself. If I quickly just draw a shape, we'll note that the 0, 0 layer is selected, and once I draw a shape, it then becomes a live layer that we're working with. And straight away you can see there's some references to speed and power, and also output and show. What you can do is have layers that don't output, or for example if you are halfway through a job and you just want to output certain layers and cut the rest later, you can turn them on and off. You can also hide them completely. And then we have the mode. Now the mode is whether you want to do that shape as a line, a fill, a line, or a fill, and an offset fill, and I'll quickly talk through those now. Obviously line is fairly self-explanatory. If you have a shape like that, it will simply do the line or the path that is that shape. If we select the fill, what it will do is treat that line as an actual shape, and it will fill it with the laser, so it will, you know, constantly go left, right, left, right, left, right, and engrave it all. Fill and line is a combination of the both, as it suggests. Now when you do a fill, what you often end up with slightly soft edges from where the laser gets to the end and then has to traverse back in the opposite direction. So the line fill option will fill it all in and then go around the outside and do a very crisp line just to sharpen that edge up. The offset fill is a new feature that's available, and I'll quickly show you the difference between the fill and the offset fill. So by default the fill will fill the box in going left to right in horizontal lines, or you can change that, but either way it's in perpendicular lines. And if we click the preview button, you can should just about be able to see there on the screen all of the different lines in going back and forth. And if we wind this back, you'll see how it interprets it and builds it up. We click OK. Now if we change this to offset fill, what it will do is treat the shape as the fill line. So in this case, rather than doing it left to right lines, it will draw squares inside the box continually to fill it out. And if we go to the preview, you'll see that's evident now in the way it's filling it out. Now this isn't always needed, but for certain jobs it will add a better finish doing it in this method. Most of the times though, the normal fill is sufficient. Now we can adjust these power settings down here, and we've got a few options to play with. You can also double click on the layer and it will give you the different options to adjust as well. If we go back just to line for the moment, you can see that we can adjust the speed and the power. You can even rename the layer if you like. And we've got a few different choices. For example, if you're cutting, you can up the amount of passes to ensure it goes through the full thickness of your material. In the advanced feature, there are additional things that you can play with, such as the lead-ins and lead-outs. As I say, we don't need all these settings at the moment, it's just useful to know that they're there. Similar options are available under the fill and line, and you can control the spacing between the lines. You can also control the overscanning. This is a really useful feature for when you're filling an object. The 3018 Pros typically have a slower acceleration than something like a belt driven laser, and what you often find is the edges of your images have a slightly darker burn than the middle sections, and this is one way to control it, because it will just shoot past the end point a little bit and then reverse and come back, and it allows the laser to get up to full speed before the laser kicks in and minimises that burn down the edge. Next we have the Move tab. Now this is where you'll conduct the basic movement of your laser and being able to position it at the start. You should be familiar with these types of controls. You have the basic directional arrows, forward, back, left, right, and you also have the Z control with these up and down arrows here. And on the right hand side we can control the increments that they move in. So if, for example, at the moment that's at 10mm and I click right, the laser will move right 10mm at a speed of 1000mm per minute. Similarly, the speed of the Z is also available to control. Now, as default, these often open with higher values, so just make sure they're within reasonable values for your machine. We also have the fire button. Now, if you remember, we turned this option on in the settings earlier, and this just basically allows the laser to fire at a very low rate in order for you to see where it is positioned. You can change this power setting up to a higher percentage. It may even show 0% on your machine, but it's just useful to know and keep it at a low level, otherwise it will burn your material as you're trying to move the laser about. The next tab we're going to focus on is the console. Now this is basically where you get to control the machine via the GRBL code, and as we saw earlier you can look at all your settings. For the most part you won't need to use this unless you do need to type a specific setting in, but it is useful if you're trying to keep track of the code being sent back and forth to your machine. Now I'm not going to focus on the other two tabs because they are quite advanced. One is using the camera control, as we touched on earlier, and the other is variable text. This is just useful if you're doing something like maybe labels or name badges or those type of things where you might be engraving lots of different names onto something. You can load a file in, and rather than you having to manually type everything out, the software can pull all that information in and do it automatically. But as I say, it's quite an advanced feature. At the bottom of this section we have some of the controls for sending our job across. So once we've designed our job, this is basically where we will tell the laser to go and run it. You've got the obvious controls such as the stop, the pause and the start. Just below this we have the framing options. You can get the machine to just run around the edge, just showing you the parameters of your machine that it can work in. The save G code is a useful function if perhaps you're trying to send the design to somebody else to engrave, or even if you're trying to run it on a different machine or via a different program. So even though Lightburn controls your machine, you can export the G code and perhaps run it through something like UGS or Candle rather than having to do the control within Lightburn itself. Now these next settings down here, if you remember earlier I briefly spoke about the squares in this bottom left hand corner. Now as default this may load up and say absolute coordinates, and as you can see I've just switched that to absolute coordinates and the green dot has come back down into the bottom corner. If you have limit switches, as I say, it will always treat this as your default. But if you don't have limit switches, as often is the case on a 3018 Pro, you will need to change this to current position, and what we should see is that green box in the bottom left hand corner will jump up to the shape above it. Now what this is telling the laser to do is, rather than starting from this bottom left hand corner, it's going to start from the corner of the shape, and this is often more accurate if you're not working to the full size of your bed as well. Now if we draw another shape, this green dot should move to what it defines as the bottom left hand corner. Because we've drawn the shape below, the green dot should move down. There we are, and if we draw one to the left of it, it should go out even further. So it's always defining the start point as the bottom left of your design. You can also move that green dot to be somewhere else. For example, if you find it easy to start your job from the center, if you click the job origin into the center, you'll now see that's jumped up into the middle. Most of the times I often start from the bottom left, but it is personal preference and it's often relevant to the design you're doing. A little bit further down we have the optimized cut path. Now by default Lightburn will try and optimize the path as best as it can, and you can select optimization settings in order to control these. Now you can change whether it does it by layer, by priority, and you can even go through and try and minimize the amount of travel if you find that more useful, or the amount of directional changes. Each one will adjust the end result slightly in terms of how long it takes, but you can play about with them. By default though, just leave it as it is and see how you get on. If this is grayed out to begin with, you may just need to turn your optimized path off and then back on. Now we're going to head up to the top and take a look at some of these icons up here. I say it looks like there's a lot, but they are quite basic. You should be familiar with things like open, save, undo, redo, copy, paste, and then delete. We have a few options for zooming in and out of the stage, which we can do, or to be able to zoom to a certain frame selection by clicking, and that will just zoom into whatever it is that you've selected. Next, the camera icon. This is grayed out because we're not using a camera. I'm just going to zoom back out slightly. The next option is the preview mode. So whenever you've done a design and you've got your power settings all correct up here, you can click on the preview button and it will show you what it's going to be doing and how it will do it. So as we pull this back to the start, you can see because we had the origin set in the center, that is where it's going to begin, and then it will come down to the bottom left of the first shape, work through it, fill it in, do the second shape, and so on. And this is just a good idea, one, to get an indication of how long your job is going to take, but also the path it is going to take in order to cut it. The next few options are just to load up the settings tabs that we went through earlier. They're just shortcuts to get to them. The next couple of icons are to do with grouping and ungrouping. So if you select more than one object, you can select multiple objects by clicking on them and holding down Shift. And you'll now see that that's become live, which means we can group those two options together and then ungroup them as well. The next few options are all about alignment. So we can mirror things and flip things over. We can also align them to one side, align them centrally, align them to the right, and you can just work through them and understand the different alignment options that you've got. The final few are about aligning things to the artboard itself. So as you'll see, we've got these two objects selected down here, and if I click the top left, it's going to bunch them all up to the top left of the stage. There you are. We'll zoom out a little bit more to the full parameters of the stage. Now if I select the bottom right, those should jump all the way down here. So it's just useful to know those, and rather than manually trying to drag everything about, you can use those to save yourself a bit of time. The next row below is more about your coordinates and positioning along with the size of things. So if we select an object, it will tell us the X and Y position. It will also tell us the height and width of it, and we can change these by going up and down. Obviously if you unlock it, it will do it out of proportion or out of synchronization. So if we turn that off and we just want to increase the width, we can do that. Or if you want to reduce something by a certain percentage, let's say we want to halve this and take it down to 50%, can enter that in and it will adjust it. You can also adjust the position that it is changing it from. So if I put this to the top to the bottom right, when I adjust the size, it should shrink down from the top left in this direction. So if I do that now, so link these again, sorry, there we are. And you can also rotate it by putting specific figures in or manually typing something in and hitting enter. Now as you'll see, that moves slightly because the position was set to the bottom right. If we put that to the middle, and when we click the rotate button, it will now do it from the center. Hit enter again, there you are. Also change your size measurements, what we touched on earlier. If you find it easier to work in a specific one, you can change it from here, or if you need to switch between them. The next one is the font settings that we've already touched on. Now this only becomes live when you have fonts to edit, but you can go through and change all the various settings that you need to for those. And that pretty much covers all of the tools, and as I say, it's a lot to take in, but the more you use it, the more you will get used to what they do. What we're going to do now is go back to the start and have a fresh artboard and start to design something. To do that, we're just going to go new. No, we don't want to save it. and then we've got a new area to work with. So with a blank artboard, let's begin to design something. Now the piece of wood that I'm going to be working with today is approximately 180mm wide by 160mm high. So I'm going to start by drawing that on the artboard. So I will quickly draw a square. Now what I'm going to do is set those sizes based on what I just mentioned. I'm going to turn the unlock feature off so that I can adjust each dimension individually. So we said the width is 180, hit enter, and the height is 160, and we hit enter. Now I know that's roughly the size of the piece of wood that I'm going to be working with, and that is on the base layer 00. So what I'm going to do now is select another layer to actually start doing my work on. I think what I'm going to do today is create something that we might find actually a bit useful, a caution laser in use sign. If you haven't seen these, you have a big word saying caution, laser in use in slightly smaller words, and then some sort of laser symbol running in between them. So to start off with, what I want to do is draw a small square, or small rectangle I should say, just over here. Now I'm going to array this round in almost a sun pattern, or maybe like a clock face, so we have multiple versions of them. So we click on the array tool, and we want to take this up to 12, as I say, similar to a clock face. Now we can see there's 12 copies there, but it's not how I want it to display. I want it to be more open in a bigger circle. So what we'll start to do is up these values until we get it to how we want it to be. We can start to space these out until we get it to something similar to what we want. I think that should be big enough. I'm going to click OK there. And what I'm going to do is just move all of these to the side. Now, a quick tip, if you drag from one direction from the left to the right, it will only select the items that are fully within the drag square. If you select from the right to the left, it selects everything that the line touches. So we'll do that and go over everything. Now it's selected all the items, and we can simply drag them over to the left hand side. Now the next thing we want to do is draw a small circle within this gap here. So we're going to come up to the circle icon, we're going to come into the middle. Now it doesn't need to be perfectly in the center, we'll sort that out shortly. Now as you can see, as I'm dragging this about, it's not a perfect circle, it's an ellipse shape. If you hold down the shift button, that makes it a uniform circle. Now, I think that's about the size that we want, but now we need to put it in the center of this space. So what we'll do is come back up to the arrow tool, and we're going to use the alignment tools up here. Now just to tell you how these work, when you're trying to align two objects, it will align it to the last one that you select, and I'll show you this in an example. So if I select this one first and then the circle last, it should bring the rectangle into the center of the circle. That's not what we want it the other way around. So I'll undo that for now. And if I reselect them, but selecting the rectangle last, it should make that the center origin. And therefore it moves the circle into alignment with that. And we're going to do the similar with the horizontal as well. So we select the circle and we'll select this one just to make sure they're in alignment. There we are, everything's now matching up. So what I want to do now is extend this line out to the right a bit. So I'm going to click on it, and we'll see we've got the anchor point around it for adjusting. I'm going to click on the middle one and simply drag it out. And I also want to drag it this way to touch the circle, because we're going to blend those two shapes shortly. So now those two shapes are overlapping, what I basically want to do is turn this shape into one. So we'll select both of them, hold down the shift key to select multiple items, and then come over to merging tools over here, and what we want to do is use the union tool, and that will make it into one shape. So now that we have the laser symbol roughly done, let's add some text to it. So we'll come over to the text symbol, and what I want to do is add the text on a different layer. So I'm going to want this to be a different density of power than the actual laser symbol. So we're going to select a new layer, and then we're going to click for the type tool, and we're just going to type laser. Actually, let's do that in uppercase, and then underneath we're going to put in use. I just need to reposition this a bit better, so I'm going to drag this over to sit on top of the line. And actually what I want to do is make this text a little bit bigger to fill more of the space. We're just going to pull that up and then reposition that slightly again by dragging it down. I'm pretty happy with that sitting there. But what we need to change is the laser symbol stops before the end of the text. So we need to extend this out to come to the similar position as to where the R and the E end. Now, if we select the item and we just use the anchor points to adjust this, what will happen is if you see where the circle was, that becomes an ellipse shape because we're adjusting the whole shape together. What we want to do is just move these 2 points on the end. So we'll undo that, Control Z, or you can use your buttons up here. And what we're going to do is just edit the 2 nodes on this end. So we'll come down to the Edit Node tool. And what we're going to do is zoom in a little bit. As you can see, there's 2 anchor points on here. If we hold down Shift, select one and then select the other, now we can just move those 2 points rather than all the other points over here. So we'll click on them and drag them out. That's roughly where we want them to be. Now I'm just going to zoom back out slightly. You can do this with your scroll wheel on your mouse, which makes it more useful than keep using the buttons up here. Now the next thing I want to do is add a big word saying cautious up here. So we're going to do the type tool again, but I'm going to want this just to be an outline, whereas I'm going to want this text to be a fill. Now I'm speaking about the different settings. We'll come back to the layers shortly and adjust all of those, but I'm just getting the basic design done first. So we're going to click on the artboard and we're going to type caution. Now I think we're going to make this a bit bolder as well and maybe a little bit bigger. So if we come up here and turn bold on, you see that's gone slightly wider. Now what I want to do is position this to the edge of this line here so they both align. So we've got the text already selected and we'll click this item and then we'll click align to left and that's pulled it in. Now as you can see, I've got a bit of space left here on the right hand side, so we can afford to make that text bigger. So what I'm going to do is you can either adjust the text by using the buttons over here and enlarging it. We'll just undo that, or you can adjust the text using the anchor point in a more freeform view as we've done previously by selecting the text and dragging it up to be roughly the same size. What you will notice at this point is the caution is actually in red. It's on the wrong layer. I wanted to put this on a new layer because I'm going to do this as an outline rather than a fill. To change the layer, simply once your object is selected, come down and select the layer you want it to be on. As you can see, it changes to green to represent that it's the green layer, and we also have the green layer become active in our cuts and layers panel. Now I'm pretty happy with the design overall. But what I want to do is we have a little bit more space over here, so I'm just going to enlarge everything together. So we're going to come from the right hand side and drag over everything, and this selects everything in one. And then what we can do is use the anchor point again to drag this up and fill the space much better. So with our design done, we can now start to take a look at the actual settings for the layers themselves. If I deselect everything and just click off, if we come to the preview pane, and we'll see how this currently looks. Now everything is blacked out. The reason for this is the original square that I drew, which was the outline of the wood we're going to use, is currently set to fill. So let's adjust that to begin with. So we're going to come up here and make the black layer just a line. Now I don't want this layer to output, it was just a reference for the size of the wood. So I'm going to turn the output off on that. We can see it's still showing that the line is there, but it's not going to output that in the actual preview, and as you can see it's now disappeared. So click OK and close that. The next thing we're going to do is take a look at the laser section. So I'm going to come up to the laser layer and double click into this, and what we're going to do is make this a fill. I'm going to set the speed to about 1800 and I want the power to be at about 50%. Now my laser has a slightly slower acceleration speed, so what I'm going to do is turn on the overscan and I'm going to take this up to about 4%. And as you can see, what that means, it's going to overscan every side by 1.2 mil. And it just means the lead in before the laser kicks in has a little bit of a run up to accelerate to the speed it needs to, and therefore minimise the burn-in on the edge. Now I'm happy with the line interval being at 0.1, so that should mean there'll be 10 lines for every millimetre. So we'll come down and click OK. Now let's take a look at the laser in use, which is the red layer. So we'll double click into that. Now for best practice, you could rename these so you have an idea of what every layer is. You don't have to because it's clearly indicated by the colours, but that is best practice if you want to keep things in order. For the speed, again, I'm going to do this at 1800, but I'm going to do the power at maybe a little bit less, so we're going to do this at 30%. And I also want to make this a fill as well. Actually, I want to make this a fill and a line. Now when we select fill and line, you will see we have an additional tab appear. We can turn on the overscanning like we did in the fill and take that up to 4%. But we can also come over to the line, and we have additional line options here where we can separately control the speed and the power. So I'm going to put the speed at maybe 1600 and have the power at maybe 60%. So with that done, we'll click OK. And then finally we're going to look at the caution layer, which is the green. So we'll double click into that. I want to leave that just as a line, and I'm going to make the speed for that as well at 1600, but I'm going to make the power at maybe 80%, so it should come out quite dark. And we'll click OK. Now when we preview this again, we should see that what it's going to do, obviously all these lines are the fast travel, so it's going to fill in all of this space and the laser in use, but then it's just going to do the outline of the caution. Now earlier on we turned on the overscan setting within the fill option, and what this does is it overshoots the engraving area to avoid burning the edges. And if I zoom in a little bit, we can actually see how this works. The travel path comes across, it engraves where it needs to, it then shuts off and overshoots by the 1.2 mil that we set. It then turns around, comes back, and does exactly the same on the way back in. This allows it to build up the speed before the laser engraves, and therefore stops the edge from burning. The final thing I want to do on the design actually is I want all this content in the middle to be centered to the piece of the wood. So what we're going to do is select everything in the middle. You can see it's all highlighted, and we're going to group that together in one. Now even when you group it, it still retains the information of every layer. But what I want to do is center this vertically in relation to the piece of wood. So I'm going to select that, and then I'm just going to go to this option for the center alignment, and it puts it all into the middle. Now if I deselect everything, the final thing we need to do is I like to start my jobs off in the bottom left hand corner, because that's where I can position the laser to. Now as you'll see, the green square in the middle is still taking that to be the center to be the origin. So if we come over to the job origin on the left and click the bottom left icon, we'll notice that green square has moved down to the bottom left. And what that means is when I position the laser ready to start engraving, I know I can position it in the bottom left corner of the wood, and that's where it will start from. Now even though that is selected and it's taking that to be the outline of the wood, because we're not outputting that particular layer, it doesn't affect the preview. All it simply does is adds on the slightly further travel from the bottom left. I'll zoom back in on that. There we are. We can just see it starting a little bit lower down in accordance with the alignment on the wood. So we'll click OK. We'll briefly just double check our speeds and power, and I can see actually it's a good job we did that. The fill and line is the wrong speed. So I'm going to come back in there and just take that to 1800 and click OK. And then we're ready to set the laser up and start engraving. So we'll move over to the Move tab, and this just gives us the basic controls for our laser. We'll make sure the laser is turned on and powered up, and we will just double check that everything is connected. So I'll just type $. Oh, we know it's still all connected correctly. So go back to the Move tab, and just to test it, I'm going to send this 10 mil to the right and then 10 mil back to the left, and I know all is working. Now what I will just do is check the position of the Z height. I'm going to take this to 1 millimeter. I'm going to raise the Z up slightly Place the piece of wood under. Now if you're not familiar with what this is, you'll need to watch the setting up laser video. I'll put a link in the corner. Just gives a constant depth stop so we know the height of our Z axis. I'll lower it back down onto this. And then we know that is the perfect height for engraving. The next thing we'll do is turn the fire button on. This will just allow us to position the laser on the corner of the wood. Now do be cautious that you are wearing glasses at this point when we start to fire the laser up. Now you should just be able to see that on the camera. And we're going to position that to the corner of the piece of wood. So we'll bring it back. Still left it at 1 mil so I can control it a bit fine. And then take it to the left. And that's on the corner of the wood. So now we can turn the fire option off. We know that's in the correct position. Now as we already have the start from current position in the right option, is say if you have user origin or absolute coordinates and you don't have limit switches, you will need to put it on current position. And just a reminder, this is telling the laser to start from that green square there rather than the red square in the corner. So with everything ready, we can now click start. We may get a warning message saying this is cutting out of bounds, but it is just a safety message and we know we are well within the bounds of the piece of wood that we're working with. So if you remember, on this layer we had the fill and line option selected, and as you can see, once it's finished the fill, it does a line around everything, and it'll do this on every letter to give it a nice crisp edge. So there we have it, our first sign done in Lightburn. Upon reflection, we should have gone a bit darker with some of the lettering and the laser symbol, but that's the joys of laser work. We can throw another piece of wood in, change a few settings and have a new result in a fairly short amount of time. We have barely touched the surface of what Lightburn can do, and I'll be covering more in future episodes. But for the small investment, you can do everything in one place rather than flipping back and forth between the free alternatives, and hopefully you do see that as well. So that is everything for today's episode. As always, thumbs up and subscribe if you like the video, and if you wanted to support the channel further, please check out the Patreon link in the description below. It really does help me. And I will see everyone on the next video.